The Concordia Cemetery has muscled through one challenge after another through the years. This nonprofit, all-volunteer, historic Buffalo institution really has a story to tell. Luke Moretti and photographer Dan Holland take us on a journey to Concordia, then and now.
They say every stone has a story.
Didn't have to be rich. You still had a story in your life to tell.
Stories that transcend the sadness of death.
We have to remember our history to know where we came from.
Across these 15 acres, tucked away on Buffalo's east side, is a snapshot in time where the past helps define the beginnings of a proud community.
This place is loved as it has never been loved before.
Enter Concordia, one of the oldest cemeteries in Western New York.
Our heart is here because our family's here.
Formed in 1859, the term Concordia means harmony, a reference to three churches coming together to share the burial ground. In those early days, the German influence in Buffalo was substantial. Concordia was initially founded as a final resting place for those early German settlers. But in the years that followed, the cemetery transitioned to reflect Buffalo's rich diversity.
Now there's every culture, every ethnicity buried here, every religion.
There are roughly 20,000 people buried at Concordia, although you wouldn't know that judging by the number of tombstones.
As you can see when you look around, it looks relatively empty. It looks like we have a lot of space left to sell, but we don't. A lot of times, years ago, families, the father would die or the mom would pass away, and the surviving parent had kids to raise, and they just couldn't afford a tombstone at the time. They had to buy food for the living. They couldn't afford to buy stones for the dead.
The remains of over 500 war veterans, many who fought in the Civil War, are buried here. That includes more than a dozen members of the Buffalo-based Weidrich's Battery. The unit is credited with thwarting Confederate advances at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863.
They were famous for taking on the Louisiana Tigers, which was a much feared Southern group. They met them in battle not once but twice, the second time at Gettysburg. But they did turn back the Louisiana Tigers, and it was a fierce hand-to-hand battle.
As a child, I ran through here playing with my brother to come and bring flowers.
Diane Savatiri is the president of the Concordia Foundation.
It's a connection, and this is what Concordia does.
Savatiri, who has family buried here, says it's an all-volunteer mission to preserve the past and keep telling the story of Buffalo's beginning.
It gives us that power to say we must speak up. We must, make sure that we never lose what we have gained through the years. And, that's the stories here.
These unique tombstones, some fading from time and nature, read like a who's who in the book of Western New York history. Among them,
we've got a vaudeville actress who is here.
From the stage to the battlefield, there's William Moeller, a sergeant in the Union Army who lost an arm in the Second Battle of Bull Run in the Civil War.
Also, we have a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient buried here.
He's John McHugh, who was cited for his actions during the Indian Wars of 1876. McHugh was described as a humble man who passed away with little fanfare. And then there's Rosa Jackson Lumpkin, believed to be one of the oldest persons in the world at the time of her death.
She was between 115 and 118 because she didn't have a birth certificate, so she had to rely on family members to tell her when she was born. She had been born to former slaves and came to Buffalo as part of the Great Migration when African Americans were leaving the South.
Traveling across the grounds at Concordia, you notice that some stones convey a celebration of life and portrayed death as a peaceful state.
So we think of it as a living museum. There's a lot you can learn here about your ancestors. There's a lot of epitaphs in German. Some of the stones list where they were born and came from.
One of the most talked about stones is this one, where Louis Schmand is buried. He was only 17 when he hopped a train to go out and look at the country in 1877.
In the 1800s, it was something to do. They'd jump aboard a freight train and go out to see the country.
A few weeks after leaving Buffalo, he was found murdered in Ohio. Why is this stone so special? It's believed to be the only one in Western New York with a curse inscribed on one side. A curse written in German and squarely aimed at the killer.
From deep within my heart, you will be handed over to a higher power for swift judgment. You are wished a curse upon your soul when the time is right. Our translator said it was written by a woman, so we assume it's his mother, who was just angry beyond belief.
As far as anyone knows, the killer was never found. While moved from their original location, a pre-Civil War farmhouse and barn are still on the premises. So it's no wonder Concordia Cemetery has both state and national historic designation. But the road from what was once farmland along today's Walden Avenue to sacred burial ground has been quite the odyssey.
Not that long ago, about 20 years ago, when it was a working cemetery, the treasurer absconded with over $154,000, and that pretty much bankrupted it.
Bonnie Fleischauer, Concordia's public information officer, says the board quit and left the cemetery with no caretaker.
If you came here during that time, the grass would be waist high. If you were trying to find a headstone, you just couldn't.
But just when the cemetery was facing its darkest hour, brighter days were on the horizon. An army of grassroots volunteers decided to take charge, and that's the way it's been ever since.
We have every hope that the future for Concordia Cemetery is bright.
David Speth, president of Concordia Cemetery, like many other volunteers, has family buried here. He remembers these grounds always being a challenge, even as a kid visiting in the 1960s.
For years, my grandmother took me to the wrong gravestone in the back because it was all worn and she couldn't read it. And she said, "This is your great-great-grandfather." And it wasn't. My great-great-grandfather was several yards away. It was another relative with the same last name.
Concordia's transformation continues even today, 161 years later. And while there aren't many burials anymore, with only a few dozen graves left to sell, there's plenty of work to be done. For one, keeping the grass trimmed is a full-time job, requiring a healthy appetite to landscape, or, in this case, enlisting a herd of hungry goats. And why not? The cemetery can use the help.
It's nice to at least see something's being done.
Thomas and Kathleen Parrish saw the grazing goats on the news, and that got them thinking, maybe it's time for a trip to Concordia.
I remembered as a kid, my mother bringing me down to be with my grandfather's grave. And I never realized this is where it was that she brought me. So I came down to try to find it.
And so they searched. Under a blazing summer afternoon sun, they trekked across this field of days gone by, a generation from long ago, with hopes and dreams of building a better life.
Well, it's very interesting, like the dates are so far back. 1803 is the one that we found, and then there are a few newer ones mixed in too that they don't have any markings on yet because the people haven't passed away, and they're going to be buried in this older cemetery.
It's that sort of connection that makes this place so special, volunteers say, and worth the fight to keep the stories of each stone, each life lived, relevant for generations to come.
This is Buffalo, and without it, if we lose any more of these stories, we don't know who we were and how we got to where we are.
That's Concordia, then and now. Luke Moretti, News 4.
Wow, thank you, Luke. And because the Concordia Cemetery is completely nonprofit, the operation relies on volunteers and donations. So if you're interested in helping, you can find out More information right on our website, WIVB.com.